Welcome to a Sherlock Holmes mystery. A bell rings in an empty church. A man lies dead before the bell ever sounds. A mechanism ticks where no hand turned it. And at the hour of peace, someone plans murder by design. But before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Tell us below. It was one of those frost-bitten December mornings when London seems cloaked in a pall of silver mist, and even the hansom cabs move through the streets as if reluctant to disturb the stillness of the air. The clock of street poles had just struck 7 when Mrs. Hudson, with a face of mild alarm, entered our sitting room at Baker Street bearing a telegram upon a small tray. Holmes, who had been standing by the fire, pipe in hand and eyes half closed in thought, turned sharply at the sound of her voice. "A telegram, Holmes," I said, noting the faint tremor in her tone. He took it without a word, unfolded it with that precise economy of motion that was peculiar to him, and read aloud, "Urgent. Please come at once. Tragedy at St. Agnes Church. The bell tolled for a man already dead. Inspector Lestrade." Holmes' eyes brightened. "The bell tolled for the dead, you say, Watson? But according to Lestrade, it tolled for the dead man himself. Curious indeed. I could not but shiver slightly. Perhaps an accident, Holmes, a church sexton confused, or a tragic coincidence." "Coincidence, my dear Watson, is a word only the dull use to mask their ignorance of cause," Holmes replied with quiet amusement. "There is no such thing as coincidence, only convergence." Within half an hour we were rattling through the fog toward Bloomsbury in a cab, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. The driver had to peer through the gloom to discern the turning toward St. Agnes Church, an old stone edifice hemmed in by narrow lanes and surrounded by a churchyard whose bare trees clawed at the mist like fingers seeking warmth. Lestrade awaited us. At the gate, his familiar bowler hat pulled low and his moustache rimed with frost. "Thank heaven you've come, Mr. Holmes. I've not seen the like in all my years." "Then we are assured of something worth our time," Holmes said briskly. "What exactly occurred?" Lestrade led us toward the church door. "A wedding was to take place here this morning. The vicar, Reverend Phelps, was to officiate. But when he entered at dawn to prepare the altar, he found the great bell already ringing. Mind you, though, the bell rope was untouched. And when he went up to the belfry," Lestrade's voice dropped, "he found a man lying dead beneath it." Holmes's eyes flickered. A mechanical impossibility and a corpse most felicitous companions for deduction. Continue. "The man's name is Henry Bracknell, a clockmaker by trade, well known in the parish. He had been engaged to repair the church clock only last week. Reverend Phelps says the bell began to ring at 6 precisely, but when he reached the belfry, Bracknell was already lifeless, as though struck down by the sound itself." "Cause of death?" Holmes asked. Lestrade shrugged. "The doctor can't say yet. No wounds, no sign of struggle, no poison that he can tell. He looks, well, as if he simply stopped living." Holmes' long fingers steepled before his face. "A man who fixes clocks found dead beneath one, while the bell tolls itself for his passing. A grim poetry to it, Watson. We entered the church. The air within was colder than without, heavy with the faint scent of wax and old stone. The bell rope hung motionless in its frame, yet even as I looked up, a faint tremor seemed to pass through the tower. A whisper, a sigh, as though the building itself remembered the sound of that fatal toll. Bracknell's body lay beneath the bell ladder, pale and rigid. One arm outstretched toward the rope as if he had tried to seize it in his final instant. His eyes were open wide, staring not with fear, but with an almost questioning expression." Holmes bent over the corpse. "Observe, Watson, no marks on the neck, no bruising at the temples, and yet—" He leaned closer, inhaling lightly. "Do you perceive it?" I knelt beside him. "A faint scent. Something metallic, perhaps." "Exactly. Iron, but not blood. The odor of old mechanisms, oil and dust. And there, upon the man's sleeve, the smallest trace of white powder. Holmes rubbed a gloved finger across it. Lime dust. Odd that one should encounter lime in a belfry. Lestrade frowned. Lime, you say? There's some stored in the churchyard shed for mortar repairs, but I can't see what that has to do with— Holmes interrupted softly. Everything has to do with everything, my dear Lestrade. That is the difficulty of truth. It hides in the connections others overlook. He stood and gazed up the bell tower. The faint dawn light caught the brass of the great bell, and for an instant its shadow fell perfectly over the body below. Holmes's face was unreadable. Watson, we shall return this evening. I have no doubt that before nightfall the bell will toll again, but this time, not for the dead. The frost glinting on his coat as the sound of his boots echoed down the nave. I followed in silence. The image of that pale, staring face fixed in my mind, and the haunting thought that perhaps, somewhere in the unseen gears of London's winter night, death had learned to tell time. The fog had thickened by the time we returned to Baker Street, and the familiar warmth of our sitting room came as a blessed relief. Holmes, however, seemed scarcely aware of it. He paced before the fire in that restless manner which told me that his mind was engaged upon some intricate point of reasoning. His hands were clasped behind his back, his head slightly bent, and from time to time he muttered a few disjointed words: lime, iron dust, the tolling bell, no mark of violence, as though aligning each fragment of evidence in its proper order. At length he turned abruptly. Watson, it is an error to treat this as a simple death. Every symptom suggests orchestration and intelligence behind the appearance of the impossible. The bell that rang itself, the corpse below it, and the trace of lime, each is a note in a composition most deliberate. I filled his pipe from the tobacco jar. But surely, Holmes, there must be a physical explanation. A loose mechanism, perhaps? The bell rope shifting with some draught? Holmes took the pipe from me, but did not light it. You are reasoning as any honest man might by common sense. But the criminal mind, Watson, does not operate within such bounds. It creates conditions that mimic impossibility precisely to mask simplicity. Remember the case of the crooked man, or the engineer's thumb deception concealed in apparent wonder. He seated himself suddenly. Let us apply order. What do we know? He held up one long finger for each point. First, Henry Bracknell, a clockmaker, was engaged to repair the mechanism of St. Agnes Church. Second, he was found dead beneath the bell at the precise moment it began to toll without any hand upon the rope. Third, there was a scent of iron and oil, indicating recent mechanical work. Fourth, the presence of lime dust, though there is no logical reason for it within the belfry. And lastly, Reverend Phelps reports hearing the bell before entering the church, meaning the sound originated autonomously. I nodded. All of which points, as you say, to some deliberate construction. But to what end? Bracknell was a craftsman, not a man of wealth or influence. Who would profit by his death? Ah, Holmes said softly, that, my dear fellow, is precisely the pivot of the riddle. When we know why the bell rang, we shall know who made it ring. He rose again and went to his desk, rummaging among his chemical vials and instruments. Selecting a small lens and a phial of reagent, he said, I took a sample from Bracknell's sleeve when you were examining the body. Observe. He dropped a speck of the white dust into the liquid. It fizzed faintly, then turned a pale green. Hydrated lime, he murmured. Used in mortar? Yes, but also in certain industrial compounds for neutralizing acid. And where would one find both lime and iron dust in company, Watson? I hesitated. In a foundry, perhaps, or a clockmaker's workshop. Precisely. Yet, not merely any clockmaker's. Lime in this quantity serves to absorb moisture around delicate mechanisms used when a machine is meant to remain untouched for a long period. Imagine, Watson, a clock designed not to mark hours, but to strike once, at a chosen moment, when its master is far away. I stared at him. You think Bracknell built such a device? That the bell tolled by mechanism, not miracle. Undoubtedly. But for whom? And why should its completion cost the man his life? There lies the real artifice. Holmes glanced at the clock upon our mantel, then snapped shut his casebook. We dine early today. At dusk, we return to Street Agnes. I must test a hypothesis. That evening, under a darkening sky, we approached the church once more. The fog had thinned to a spectral veil, and the gas lamps glowed faintly upon the gravestones. The Reverend Phelps awaited us by the door, a timid man in his 50s, with watery eyes and hands that trembled even in prayer. "Mr. Holmes, I confess the place chills me now," he said. "Each time the wind stirs, I fancy I hear the bell again." "Fear often imitates memory, Reverend," Holmes replied. "Tell me, was anyone else aware Bracknell was working here last night?" "Only myself and the verger, Mr. Cobb. He locked the gate after the man left at 10. Holmes regarded the man keenly. "And you are certain he left?" "Certain, sir. I bade him good night myself." Holmes' expression hardened slightly. "Then someone must have returned later, someone with a key." He led us up the narrow belfry stair. The boards creaked beneath our feet. Cobwebs trembled in the flickering lantern light. When we reached the top, Holmes examined the bell frame with minute attention. He ran his fingers along the iron brackets, then knelt to inspect the great wheel that wound the rope. A faint smile touched his lips. "There it is, Watson," he whispered. "See this notch filed upon the rim, and this tiny gear affixed by fresh screws. A man of skill made this, someone who wished the bell to sound at a particular time, without human touch." "But Bracknell built it himself?" I asked. "Unquestionably. Yet not for himself." Holmes straightened. "This mechanism is incomplete, one piece missing, perhaps removed before the event. Whoever took it ensured the bell would turn once, then halt forever. Bracknell's death was the silence that followed his own creation." He closed his lantern, casting the chamber into shadow. "We have our first proof, Watson. This was murder by design. The bell did not toll for the dead, it created him." The following morning broke clear and cold, the frost still tracing its delicate lacework upon the window panes, when I descended to breakfast. Holmes was already at the table, pale and keen-eyed, his coffee untouched and a newspaper spread before him. He looked up as I entered, and I saw at once that he had spent the night in deep thought, for his violin lay upon the chair beside him, and the ash in the grate bore witness to long hours of solitude. "Good morning, Watson," he said briskly. "Our case has ripened overnight, like a fruit too long on the branch. The Morning Chronicle has seen fit to call the event at Street Agnes the tolling miracle, which is an excellent phrase for selling papers, but deplorable one for the pursuit of truth. Sit down. There is much to consider." He pushed the newspaper toward me, his long forefinger resting upon a column of print. The report described the discovery of Henry Bracknell's body, the mysterious ringing of the bell, and a suggestion made by no less a person than Reverend Phelps that some supernatural agency had been permitted to manifest itself. I read it twice and laid the paper down. "Surely you don't mean to entertain that notion, Holmes?" "Only fools and poets entertain the impossible, my dear Watson. I am content to explain it." He rose and paced slowly. "I spent part of the night considering the matter of the missing component from Bracknell's mechanism. If a man constructs a device to toll a bell at a set hour, and that mechanism is later found incomplete, we must ask not only who removed the missing part, but when." "You suspect the verger?" I asked. "He alone had the key." Holmes shook his head. "Too obvious. Cobb may be dull, but dullness does not equate to deceit. Besides, the precision of the act suggests intellect, not clumsiness. The key to this puzzle lies in Bracknell himself. Tell me, Watson, what kind of man spends his nights perfecting machinery meant to move unseen, and dies at the very hour it comes to life?" "A man obsessed," I replied. "Perhaps driven by some private compulsion." "Precisely. But obsession has motive, and motive implies direction. Bracknell's workshop is in Clerkenwell, a district not without its curious tradesmen. I propose we pay it a visit. Within the hour, we were once again in a cab, this time rattling through the lively streets of Clerkenwell. The morning bustle had begun, vendors shouted their wares, and the smell of roasting chestnuts mingled with the sharp tang of smoke. Bracknell's shop was a modest one, narrow, with a faded sign reading Bracknell and Sons, horologists and repairers of fine timepieces. The door hung slightly ajar. Inside, dust lay thick upon every surface, as though weeks had passed since the tools were last disturbed. Holmes's gaze swept the room. Note the condition, Watson. A man employed in work as delicate as clockmaking does not tolerate such disorder. This neglect suggests he had abandoned his craft, at least his lawful one. He moved to a bench scattered with cogs, screws, and small glass jars. Taking up one, he examined the label. Mercuric chloride, he murmured. And here, potassium nitrate. Materials for cleaning brass? No. These are chemical agents with far more curious applications. A soft rustle drew my attention to a ledger lying half open upon the counter. Its pages were filled with neat figures, but one entry stood out, written hastily, almost scrawled. 4R. Final adjustment complete. Mechanism to activate at 6. Payment upon delivery. Holmes' eyes gleamed. You see? A single initial, but it may be our thread through the labyrinth. He rifled through the remaining pages. Here again, repairs for R. And again, special order bell gear. This was no ordinary customer, Watson. Someone commissioned Bracknell to design that device and intended it to serve a very particular purpose. I frowned. Perhaps the payment was never made. Bracknell could have threatened exposure. A sound deduction, Holmes said approvingly. A craftsman cheated of his due. Confronting a patron of means and secrecy, it is a recipe for tragedy. Yet, there is still the question of the church. Why choose Street, Agnes, as the stage for this macabre demonstration? He crossed to the wall, where a single framed photograph hung crookedly, a group of men before the church itself, the bell tower visible behind them. Bracknell stood among them, and beside him a tall, dark-haired gentleman whose face bore the unmistakable stamp of authority. Holmes tapped the glass. There's our phantom, Watson. This man was not present at the scene, yet his likeness clings to it like a shadow. Mark him well. I have seen that face before. He turned sharply toward the door. We returned to Lestrade at once. There is someone he must help us find. For now, keep your revolver close at hand. When a bell tolls for the dead, it is never satisfied with one. By the time we reached Scotland Yard that afternoon, the pale winter sun had sunk into a haze of gold behind the rooftops, leaving London veiled in a dim half-light. Holmes was in high spirits, the way he often was when the pattern of an enigma began to yield its outline beneath his scrutiny. Lestrade met us in his office, a look of weary irritation upon his face, though I could see he was not displeased to find Holmes bringing new developments. Well, Mr. Holmes, I've had the verger and the vicar both in for questioning, Lestrade began, motioning us to sit. Cobb insists he locked the church at 10, and the Reverend stands by his claim that no one else possessed a key. The locksmith confirms that all the locks are sound. Unless our killer flew through the window, we're left chasing ghosts. Ghosts, my dear Lestrade, seldom pay for custom clockwork. He laid the ledger we had taken from Bracknell's shop upon the inspector's desk. You will observe the entry for R. Final adjustment complete. It suggests a client with means, perhaps influence, who wished to remain unnamed. I require your assistance in identifying any local patrons whose surname begins with R and who have connections to Street, Agnes Parish. Lestrade peered at the handwriting. There's a Lord, Redmayne resides on Russell Square. Church benefactor, respectable family. Another, a Mr. Rourke. Trades in metals, industrial contracts, iron foundries. That sort of thing. Both known to the vicar, I believe. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Rourke, you say? In metals? He rose suddenly, pacing toward the window. Iron dust upon the corpse, lime for moisture control, compounds for brass purification. Watson, do you not see the chain? Bracknell's mysterious client could only be a man whose trade required precision, engineering, and secrecy in equal measure. We must visit this Rourke immediately. Lestrade gave a skeptical grunt. Now see here, Mr. Holmes, you can't just walk into a businessman's home and start throwing accusations about. Quite right, Holmes said mildly, which is why we shall visit as consultants concerned with the safety of his enterprise. You, Lestrade, will remain here and arrange for an official inquiry into the matter of the church bell. By the time you receive word from me, the problem may be, if I may borrow your own phrase, cleared up nicely. Within the hour, we were en route once again, our cab wheels hissing upon the wet cobbles as we turned into a quieter district north of Holborn. The gaslights flared against the gathering fog, and the name Rourke and Company Industrial Timing Devices gleamed upon the gate of a tall, iron-fronted warehouse. A foreman led us through the echoing corridors, where rows of machinery ticked and hissed in measured rhythm. The air was heavy with oil and iron filings. At the far end stood a man of powerful build, his face clean-shaven, but his eyes restless and sharp. Mr. Rourke, I presume, Holmes said pleasantly. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my associate, Dr. Watson. We are making certain inquiries concerning the late Mr. Henry Bracknell, who, I believe, performed some commission for you. Rourke's expression tightened. Bracknell? Yes, I knew the man. Good workman. Shame what happened. But I've nothing to do with that business at the church, if that's your drift. Holmes tilted his head, watching him as a cat might watch a mouse. You speak as though you anticipated my drift, Mr. Rourke. Curious. I mentioned no location. The man's jaw clenched. It was in the papers this morning, wasn't it? Everyone's talking. Indeed, Holmes murmured. Still, your concern is most particular. Tell me, sir, what precisely did you commission from Bracknell? A timing mechanism, Rourke said shortly. An experimental device. He never delivered it. Holmes' eyes gleamed. On the contrary, he delivered it perfectly. To Street, Agnes Church. 6 o'clock sharp. For a moment, the hum of the machinery filled the silence between them. Then Rourke turned abruptly away. You've no right to come here implying things. Holmes stepped closer, his tone soft but lethal. You commissioned a device capable of remote activation, one that could toll a bell without touch. Bracknell, realizing what purpose it served, refused further involvement. You silenced him, then removed the final component to ensure the evidence pointed to mystery, not murder. Rourke's hands balled into fists. You've no proof. Holmes' eyes flashed. Not yet. But you forget, Mr. Rourke, that mechanism was designed by a craftsman of conscience. He left his signature hidden upon the gear teeth engraved initials that only reveal themselves beneath acid. When Lestrade examines them tomorrow, the name of your company will shine plain as daylight. The man's bravado faltered. His mouth opened, then closed again. Without a word, he strode toward the office door, only to find Holmes's hand already upon the latch. I would advise against flight, Holmes said quietly. The bell has rung once, Mr. Rourke. You would not wish it to toll again for you. The man's shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He was going to expose me. I only meant to frighten him. The mechanism wasn't supposed to. Holmes lifted a hand. Spare me the moral embroidery. You set death in motion and found yourself its echo. The constables will take your confession in full. As we left the warehouse, the distant chime of a church bell drifted through the fog. Holmes paused, glancing skyward with that rare, contemplative look that sometimes softened his features. You see, Watson, he said quietly, The dead do not summon bells. It is always the living who make them ring. The following evening found Holmes and me once more within the dim interior of St. Agnes Church. The gas lamps cast their feeble glow upon the stone walls, and the silence was such that even the smallest creak echoed like a whisper from the grave. The police had sealed off the belfry for official examination, yet Holmes had obtained permission from Lestrade to conduct what he termed a final experiment of confirmation. It was close upon 6, the very hour at which Bracknell had perished. Holmes moved about the nave with a lantern, its light dancing over the pews and brass fittings. His every gesture was precise, deliberate, as though he were adjusting the very machinery of fate. "Observe closely, Watson," he murmured. "The solution to this affair does not rest in confession alone. Rourke's admission satisfies the law, but not logic. There remains a detail minor, yet vital, that must align before I can call the matter complete." He led me to the bell rope, now untied and lying limp upon the floor. The air carried the scent of dust and iron, faintly mingled with the cool tang of the evening fog creeping in through the high windows. "This bell, Watson," he said, "was never meant merely to toll, it was constructed to signal. Bracknell's mechanism was designed not for spectacle, but for communication. He built it to serve as a warning." "A warning to whom?" I asked. "To me," Holmes replied simply, though he could never have known it would reach me only through his death. Before I could question him further, he ascended the narrow stairs to the belfry. I followed close behind, my lantern throwing long shadows upon the stone walls. The climb seemed endless, and with each step the air grew colder, sharper. At last, we reached the chamber where Bracknell had fallen. Holmes knelt beside the great wheel once more, examining the gear assembly with meticulous care. "You see here, Watson, the final tooth of the mechanism is filed at an angle inconsistent with the others. It creates friction, halting the wheel precisely after a single revolution. Ingenious, yes, but there is more. Look closely at the underside of this brass plate." I leaned in, and under the lantern's glow I saw, faintly etched, "Pray the bell is not his." I started. "Good heavens, Holmes, what does it mean?" "Bracknell's last act," he said softly. "He discovered that Rourke intended to use his design for more than mechanical marvels. I found correspondence among Rourke's factory accounts contracts with the Admiralty, Watson, for timing devices used in munitions. Bracknell must have realized that his innocent craft was to become an instrument of destruction. He came here to disable his own creation, to halt its activation. Instead, the mechanism, incomplete and unstable, turned upon its maker." Holmes adjusted the lantern, his face caught half in light, half in shadow. The bell tolled because the final cog slipped under its own weight, releasing the wheel. It was never murder in the common sense, it was poetic irony. Rourke's hand was in the making, yes, but the death was wrought by the very machine intended for deceit. One might almost admire the symmetry of it, if it were not so tragic. He straightened, brushing dust from his coat. "Yet I suspect Bracknell left one final message beyond the words you see. The lime, Watson, the lime was meant to preserve this inscription from corrosion. He wanted it to endure. He wanted truth to outlast his silence." I gazed down at the faint etching once more, a chill passing through me. "And Rourke?" I asked quietly. "Lestrade has him well in custody," Holmes replied. "His trial will expose enough of his dealings to satisfy the Crown. As for Bracknell, I shall see that his name is cleared. The Church will bury him not as a sinner, but as a man who tried, in his own way, to stop the machinery of death." We descended in silence. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, cloaking the graveyard in white. A single bell hung motionless above us, dark against the fading sky. Holmes paused at the gate, his breath clouding in the cold. "Strange, is it not?" he said softly. "How men fashion engines of precision to master time, yet end by being mastered by them." The bell did not summon the dead, it measured the final second of a conscience too late to act. I said nothing. We turned toward Baker Street, the crunch of snow beneath our feet, the only sound in that still winter air. And as we went, I could not shake the image of that silent bell, hanging high and unmoving, waiting, perhaps, for another soul who would one day make it ring again. The days that followed passed in a hush of snow and newspaper ink. London, in her customary fashion, absorbed the tragedy of Street Agnes and moved briskly on to the next sensation. Yet within the quiet walls of Baker Street, the matter lingered still. Holmes sat for long hours at the window, his gaze fixed upon the drifting flakes outside, his violin resting idle upon his knee. I had learned not to disturb him in such moods, for they signaled not melancholy, but reflection, a mind revisiting its own steps, testing each deduction for flaws invisible to ordinary logic. At last, one grey afternoon, he stirred and looked toward me. "Watson," he said, "our case has reached its epilogue, yet I confess to a sense of dissatisfaction." I closed my notebook, surprised. Surely the truth has been laid bare. Roque stands charged, Bracknell's innocence proven. What remains unresolved? Holmes rose and crossed to the hearth, where the fire burned low. "Motive," he said simply. "We have proven the mechanics, but not the mind. Why, Watson, should a man of Rourke's intellect commission such a device for a church bell? His enterprise in industrial timing could have prospered without this grotesque experiment." He drew from his pocket a folded letter, creased and soot-stained. "This arrived this morning from Lestrade. It appears that among Rourke's papers was a note addressed to one Admiral Percival Ray. The language is cryptic, but the implications are not." He handed it to me. I read aloud. "The prototype was tested, precision assured. The next shall not toll but detonate." I looked up sharply. "Good heavens, Holmes, you mean?" "Exactly so," he interrupted quietly. "Bracknell's device was not intended merely to toll a bell. It was a model for a remote ignition mechanism, ingenious, silent, and deadly. Rourke's plan was to sell his creation as a military instrument, one that could trigger explosives from miles away with nothing more than a calibrated clockwork impulse. Bracknell, once aware, sought to sabotage it. In doing so, he condemned himself. A grim silence fell between us. I felt a chill deeper than the winter air beyond our window. "And now?" I asked. "What of Admiral Ray?" Holmes smiled faintly, though there was little mirth in it. "The Admiralty has denied all knowledge, as bureaucracies are wont to do, yet I suspect their denial conceals embarrassment rather than ignorance. Rourke's ambitions outpaced his discretion. I have no doubt the matter will be buried under the more convenient label of industrial espionage." He turned away, pacing slowly. "It is a peculiar irony, Watson. Bracknell constructed a device meant to measure time with precision, only to become its victim. Rourke sought profit in control, yet found himself undone by the very mechanism he sought to command. The universe, it seems, has a taste for balance." I watched him closely. "And what of you, Holmes? You appear troubled still." He stopped before the window, the faint reflection of his face mingling with the snow outside. "Because, my dear fellow, I cannot decide whether Bracknell's final act was one of redemption or pride. He tampered with his own creation to save others, yes, but perhaps also to prove, even in death, that no one could perfect what he had made. It is the eternal flaw of the craftsman, to believe the work itself matters more than the hand that wields it." For a time we stood in silence, listening to the muted rumble of the city below. Then, at length, I said, "He died trying to silence the toll, Holmes. That strikes me as redemption enough." Holmes' expression softened. "Perhaps you are right, Watson. Perhaps in that final moment, he achieved what many of us strive for, a small act of defiance against the great machinery that turns unseen above us." The clock on the mantel chimed the hour 6, clear and resonant. Holmes started slightly, then smiled, faintly amused at his own reaction. "Our bell again," he murmured. "Let us hope this one tolls only for tea." Mrs. Hudson entered at that instant, tray in hand, and the faintest glimmer of warmth seemed to return to the room. As she poured, Holmes took up his violin, plucking at the strings absently. The melody that followed was soft, mournful, yet touched with a quiet dignity. "You see, Watson," he said after a while, his eyes half closed. "Men like Rourke believe they can master the rhythm of the world, but the world has its own tempo. One cannot quicken or delay the inevitable without paying a price." He lowered the bow, the final note hanging in the air like a whisper from the past. "And now," he added, setting the instrument aside, "the case of the Christmas bell that rang for the dead is closed. But I suspect, my dear friend, that somewhere out there, another sound waits to be understood." Outside, the church bells began to ring the hour once more, clear, cold, unburdened, and Holmes, gazing into the fire, seemed to listen not to their tone, but to the spaces between. It was 2 mornings later when I was roused from a pleasant doze by the unmistakable sound of Holmes moving briskly about the sitting room. I found him dressed, hat in hand, the energy of purpose gleaming once more in his eyes. "Up, Watson!" he exclaimed. "There remains an echo of our Christmas bell yet to be heard. We must not allow it to fade unanswered." I blinked sleepily. "Another case already? Or does this still concern Bracknell's affair?" "The latter, my dear fellow. I have just received word from Lestrade. Rourke was found dead in his cell early this morning. That banished the last trace of drowsiness." "Dead? But how?" "An apparent seizure," Holmes said dryly. "At least, that is the official phrasing. The prison surgeon insists it was natural causes, though the man was in sound health when taken into custody. I fear, Watson, the machinery of this affair continues to turn even without its maker." Within the hour, we were once more at Scotland Yard. Lestrade met us at the entrance, looking unusually grave. "You've heard, I suppose," he said. "We found him just after dawn. No sign of struggle. Doctor swears it was a fit of the heart, but well, you know how I feel about coincidences in your company, Mr. Holmes." "Quite so," Holmes replied. "Take us to him." Rourke lay upon the narrow cot of his cell, face pale and lips faintly blue. His right hand was clenched around something small and metallic. Holmes bent over, prying it gently loose with a penknife. When he opened his palm, we both stared in silence. It was a fragment of brass no larger than a coin engraved with a single letter. "B. Bracknell," I breathed. "Or a message," Holmes murmured. "Perhaps both." He examined the edges under his lens. "Filed recently. The cuts are clean. Someone passed this to him within the last 12 hours. Lestrade frowned. "But no one entered his cell except the guard and the surgeon." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Then the means of delivery must have been subtle. The question, Watson, is not who gave him this piece, but what it signified to him. Bracknell's work lived and died within clockwork. Yet here we find his initial return to his betrayer, like the pendulum of justice swinging home." He straightened. "Tell me, Lestrade, what hour was he found?" 6 o'clock, the inspector said grimly. Holmes's expression grew distant, his voice low. Again the toll. "I begin to think this case may be less about men and more about patterns." We returned to Baker Street as the fog rolled thick over the city. Holmes said little during the journey. Once seated again before the fire, he seemed lost in some private storm of deduction. At length, he spoke. "Rourke's death was no accident. There is an intellect cold, deliberate, completing the symmetry," Bracknell began. "Perhaps someone who shared his conscience or his guilt." I regarded him uneasily. "You believe there is another party involved?" He nodded slowly. "The evidence insists upon it. Someone had access to Rourke's cell. Someone capable of passing him that fragment, something meant to remind him of his sin, to weigh upon his mind until his heart itself gave way. A subtle execution, Watson, though the hand behind it may never be proven." For several moments there was no sound but the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Holmes rose abruptly and went to the window, drawing aside the curtain. "You see that, Watson?" he said softly. Across the street, the bell of Street Dunstan's was ringing the evening hour, 6 strokes once again, echoing faintly through the falling snow. "It follows us," he said almost to himself. "The same hour, the same tone. Perhaps London itself remembers." He turned, his features gentler now. "But no matter. The living must attend to life. We have done what justice allows. The rest belongs to time and to whatever hand winds its unseen gears." That night, we dined quietly. Holmes was uncharacteristically introspective, speaking little. Yet when I thought the evening over, he surprised me by drawing his violin from its case once more. The melody he played was slow, haunting, its final notes trailing like the distant chime of a church bell swallowed by snow. When it ended, he lowered the bow and said, almost absently, "Strange how death keeps time, Watson. It rings not for those who hear it, but for those who cannot forget the sound." I wrote those words in my journal before retiring. Long after Holmes had gone to his room, I sat by the window watching the fog thicken over Baker Street, listening to the muffled stillness of London. Then, faint and far away, a single bell rang 6 measured notes, fading into silence. I could not say from which church it came, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that Sherlock Holmes had already counted each one. The following week brought no new clients to Baker Street, and yet the atmosphere in our rooms was charged with that peculiar stillness that follows a storm. A quiet that hums with unresolved meaning. Holmes had taken to pacing again, the tips of his fingers pressed together in thought, his eyes distant but not unfocused. Each morning the newspapers devoted a few brief lines to the Street Agnes mystery. But the public's interest, as ever, was fickle. Rourke's death had closed the official file. Only Holmes, it seemed, believed the case was still unfinished. On the 8th morning, as I sat reading by the window, a small envelope slid under our door. Holmes was across the room in an instant. He examined the handwriting without opening it, the faintest glimmer of intrigue lighting his features. "Curious," he murmured. "No postage mark. Hand-delivered. The paper handmade, unpressed, likely foreign. And this ink, Watson, has the scent of ash bark. Not common in England." He broke the seal and unfolded the note. Its message was brief, written in a delicate, almost ornamental hand. "The bell has not finished ringing. At midnight on Christmas Eve it will toll once more. Come if you wish to understand." There was no signature. Holmes's expression darkened, the playful light in his eyes replaced by something sharper. "It appears, my dear fellow, that the matter refuses to rest. Midnight on Christmas Eve tonight, in fact. And the location, though unstated, can only be Street Agnes." I felt a chill pass through me. "Surely, Holmes, you do not intend to answer such a summons." He gave a faint smile. "When an adversary offers the courtesy of appointment, it is impolite not to attend. Fetch your coat, Watson. The bell demands its audience." The night was crystalline cold, the snow beneath our boots crackling like glass as we made our way through the narrow lanes toward Bloomsbury. The city slept beneath its frozen blanket, save for the occasional carriage or lamplighter passing through the mist. Street Agnes loomed before us, black against the pale sky, its tower rising like a warning finger pointed at heaven. Inside, the church was dark save for a single candle burning upon the altar. Holmes moved silently between the pews, every footstep absorbed by the stone. I followed close behind, the air thick with that peculiar stillness that seems to precede both prayer and revelation. Then, from somewhere high above, there came a faint metallic creak, the sound of movement within the belfry. Holmes froze. "We are not alone," he whispered. We ascended cautiously, the wooden stairs groaning beneath our weight. Halfway up, a gust of wind or something like it snuffed out my lantern, plunging us into near darkness. Only the dim glow of the candle below reached us, flickering through the stairwell like a dying heartbeat. When we reached the belfry, the great bell hung motionless as before, its bronze surface catching what little moonlight filtered through the louvers. Yet beneath it, a figure stood cloaked, motionless, face concealed by the hood of a long black coat. Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm. "You've chosen a theatrical hour for confession. I assume you are the author of the note." The figure inclined their head slightly. "Mr. Holmes," came a low-voiced female, deliberate and chillingly composed. "I had no wish for confession, only understanding. You see, my brother was Henry Bracknell." Holmes said nothing, though his eyes gleamed. "I could not bear that his death be written as madness," she continued. "I warned him against Rourke's work, but he would not listen. When he died, I swore the truth would be heard, even if it meant the bell must ring again. I sent the letter to Rourke in his cell. The piece of brass was my brother's mark, the one he engraved on every creation. When Rourke saw it, his heart failed him. I did not strike him down. His conscience did." The wind moaned through the tower, lifting the edge of her cloak. Holmes regarded her quietly. "You achieved your justice, madam. But why summon me?" She turned her face toward the great bell. The candlelight below flickered upward, revealing eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Because my brother's invention lives still. I have completed it." At that moment, a soft click echoed through the chamber, a gear sliding into place. The bell shuddered, then began to move. Holmes lunged forward, seizing the lever mechanism. "Watson, help me! The release is weighted!" Together we wrestled the wheel back, halting the bell's swing inches before it struck. The tower trembled with the effort, dust cascading from the beams. When at last it stilled, the woman had vanished, gone as silently as she had come, leaving only the echo of her voice behind. "She wanted it to ring once more," I gasped. "Why stop her?" Holmes's face was pale, but resolute, because she did not understand. That bell no longer calls the innocent to prayer, it calls the guilty to remembrance. Its sound, once loosed, would haunt her beyond forgiveness. We descended in silence. Outside, the snow fell in thick, muffling sheets, and the city was utterly still. At the gate, Holmes paused, glancing back at the tower. "Watson," he said quietly, "there are crimes solved by reason, and others answered only by mercy. Tonight we have seen both, and neither offers peace." The church bell remained silent that night, but as we reached Baker Street, the clock struck midnight, its tone clear and cold through the frost. Holmes looked up from beneath his hat brim, his breath clouding the air. "It seems," he said softly, "that the bell has found a kinder voice after all." And for once, he smiled, a small, human smile that lingered even after the echo faded. Christmas morning dawned over London with a strange, suspended quiet, an unnatural stillness that seemed to have folded the entire city within itself. The snow had deepened overnight, softening the hard edges of stone and pavement, and muffling even the clatter of hooves and the distant chimes of church bells. For once, Baker Street was at peace. I rose late, still heavy with the shadows of the previous night's encounter, and found Holmes already at the breakfast table, sipping his tea with an absent air. The fire crackled low, and sunlight streamed through the frost-rimmed window panes like a benediction. "Merry Christmas, Holmes," I said, though my voice was subdued. He glanced up, nodded faintly, and returned to his thoughts. "Merry, yes," he murmured, "though the ghosts of this one wear finer coats than usual." I took my seat and poured myself a cup, letting the steam soothe my hands. "Have you thought of reporting the woman? Bracknell's sister?" Holmes shook his head. "To what end? She committed no crime in the legal sense only, orchestrated a reckoning already set in motion by men more dangerous than she. The bell did not toll, Watson. That was her redemption." I nodded slowly. "Still, it haunts me how close we came. That mechanism, fully restored, could have, well, it could have stirred panic far beyond that church. Holmes looked toward the fireplace, his gaze distant. That's precisely why I took it. You what? I asked, startled. He rose, crossed to the corner cabinet, and withdrew a leather-wrapped bundle. He opened it to reveal the final component of the bell's mechanism, the small, polished gear with Bracknell's engraving, the one that would have triggered the autonomous toll. I removed it before we left, he said. She hadn't noticed. Perhaps she meant for me to take it, in the end. Or perhaps she believed it belonged to her brother alone. Either way, this piece completes nothing now. It is only memory, forged in brass. He held it between thumb and forefinger, the morning light catching its edges. Do you hear it, Watson? No ticking. No sound. It is finished. I took it from him gently and placed it on the mantelpiece, beside a sprig of holly. Let it rest, then. We sat quietly for some time, each of us deep in our reflections. Then, at length, Holmes stirred and rose to his feet with something of his usual energy. Come now, Watson. Enough of morbid solemnity. Even for those like myself, who lack sentiment, it is customary to observe some form of cheer on this day. He opened the cupboard and produced 2 glasses and a modest bottle of port. Pouring each with careful measure, he handed one to me. To Bracknell, I said, lifting my glass. A man of conscience, Holmes nodded, and to his sister who tried, in her own way, to preserve what little dignity remained of his name. We drank in silence. Outside, the distant bells of street. Paul's pealed across the city 12 strokes, then silence. This time, the bells rang, for no one in particular. Only Christmas itself. You know, Holmes, I said, setting down my glass. I can't help but wonder if this case will stay with you. It's not like the others. He smiled faintly. Few things are, but yes, it may linger. Not for the cleverness of the trap, nor the peculiarity of the device. No, it will remain because it demonstrated something I am rarely forced to acknowledge. What is that? He turned toward the window, the snow beyond glowing gold in the morning sun. That sometimes, Watson, the machine is not the thing to be feared. It is the silence after, the empty space it leaves behind. In that quiet, men hear their guilt most clearly. He turned back to me, eyes bright. But let us leave ghosts where they belong. I hear Mrs. Hudson preparing something warm, and though it pains me to admit it, I am ravenous. We rose together and moved toward the kitchen, the light streaming in behind us, the room bright and living once more. Outside, children played in the snow. Carolers wandered the streets in song, and Baker Street filled with the gentle rhythm of a world turning peacefully. No bells rang that day but those of celebration. No mechanism stirred except those in clocks and hearts. And in the stillness of a London Christmas, Sherlock Holmes allowed the case to settle the case of the Christmas bell that rang for the dead. A story not merely of death and deception, but of conscience, timing, and the fragile machinery of redemption. And so the bell remained unwound. It was some weeks after Christmas when the final loose thread of the case came to rest upon our doorstep. February had settled over London in a damp grey mist, and our days at Baker Street had returned to their usual rhythm. A few minor inquiries, an afternoon of monographs on ash tobacco, and evenings of violin or chess. Holmes seemed more at ease now, though I noticed, as ever, that peace sat upon him lightly, more like a shawl than a coat. That morning, as I perused the Times, a parcel arrived, small, square, and unmarked, save for a wax seal I recognized at once. It bore the emblem of the Bracknell family crest. Holmes examined it with his customary care before slicing it open. Inside lay a folded sheet of thick stationery and a small wooden box. Holmes read the note aloud. Mr. Holmes, you took what was never yours, but I believe you did so with intent to protect. I have no wish to reclaim the past. My brother's conscience speaks louder now than any bell ever could. Let it rest. What you hold in your hand is the final part of the mechanism, preserved not for function but for memory. I shall go north, where machines are rare and silence is still natural. Thank you for stopping what I could not. E. Holmes opened the box and revealed a polished ring of brass, finely tooled and engraved on the inner rim with a single line of Latin. Tempus tacitum judicat. I translated it aloud. Time judges in silence. Holmes held the ring delicately between thumb and forefinger, the light catching on its edge. A fitting epitaph, wouldn't you say? He placed the ring gently atop the mantel beside the gear we had recovered earlier. The two pieces, resting side by side, formed a shape unmistakably complete and yet curiously inert. Nothing ticked, no spring turned. Together, they formed a whole no longer dangerous. Holmes returned to his chair and stared into the fire. "You see, Watson," he said, "this case never truly concerned murder. It was about design, not of machines, but of choices, each as precise and irreversible as a cog once set in motion. Bracknell chose guilt over obedience. His sister chose mercy over vengeance. And Rourke, well, Rourke chose to believe he could control what he didn't fully understand." I leaned forward, drawn again into the deep current of Holmes's thoughts. "And you, Holmes? What did you choose?" He smiled faintly. "To intervene, as always, but not to dominate. A rare difference, Watson, and an important one. You see, even the greatest minds, if too certain, risk becoming what they hunt. Precision must be tempered with restraint. Otherwise, we are not detectives but engineers of catastrophe." He fell silent, his gaze locked on the flickering flames. I said nothing, respecting the moment. Outside, the world moved slowly under the weight of damp fog, and the city exhaled its soft, ceaseless breath. At length, Holmes rose and crossed to the window, pulling aside the curtain. A boy passed by on the street below, whistling a cheery tune. Across the way, a milkman exchanged a few words with Mrs. Hudson and tipped his cap. "Life, Watson," Holmes said, "goes on. That is the blessing and the burden. The bell did not toll again. And perhaps that silence, that choice, is what matters most." I joined him at the window. We stood there for a while, two men above a city always on the edge of waking or sleeping, always dreaming of order and haunted by chance. "You'll write this one, I hope," he said, his tone more gentle than usual. I smiled. "Already begun, though the ending still eludes me." He raised an eyebrow. "Let it end as it must, not with a bang, but with the echo that remains." Later that night, as I penned the final lines, I glanced up to find Holmes asleep in his chair, the fire casting long shadows across his features. Outside, the bells of Street Agnes rang the hour, distant, solemn, harmless. And so I wrote, "Thus ends the curious affair of the Christmas bell that tolled once for the dead but forever in memory. It rang not to mark death, but to call forth the better angels of conscience. And if it never rang again, perhaps that is because it was never meant to. For some things, once understood, need not be heard again." The case was closed, but its silence lingered.